This video was sponsored by World of Game Design on behalf of the ZWEIHÄNDER Reforged project. They're launching their Kickstarter on February 26th, and if you're liking what you're hearing throughout this video, you can follow the campaign using the link below. So this one's been a really fun one to conceptualize because World of Game Design reached out and they were just like, hey, we want to work together. What do you want to do for a video? I asked the lead designer, Daniel Fox, if maybe I could take a look at the Reforged and do another one of these sorts of video essays in a way, talking about the changes from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay leading into ZWEIHÄNDER and where they're kind of moving forward with this whole thing, right? So it not only meant a lot that they were willing to they wanted to reach out and talk to me about that, but they were also willing to pay for a completely honest take and almost a sort of like public consultation, and for all they knew, I was going to flay them alive. As always, I'll give you my thoughts right here up in front. With the Reforged project, what we're seeing is a bunch of laser-focused changes to the ZWEIHÄNDER core for a focus on accessibility, practicality, and kind of a redefining of what it means to die in the system or to have a quote-unquote death. This is a focus that is more of an adjustment to make it actually more faithful to Grimdark materials rather than the sort of super peasant of ZWEIHÄNDER and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in the past. They also seem to have made and fulfilled on the promise that this is going to be a backwards compatible system, so all of you old ZWEIHÄNDER fans that have a bunch of these old adventures and materials, it's not going to invalidate any of the stuff that you already own. The Grim and Perilous D100 core that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay had originally set out is looking better, more intuitive, sleeker here in Reforged than it ever previously has. I don't think any old ZWEIHÄNDER fans are going to feel very alienated here, and I think that this system actually has the benefit of drawing in a bunch more of these Souls-like fans, looking for something that gets a bit more close to that style of fantasy than something like D&D or Pathfinder. They're also going into this Reforged with the aim to make sure that third-party creators are supported. There is a truly open third-party license for this thing, as I've been told by Daniel Fox, and this is a system that has been a favorite to sort of hack. You can check out Blackbirds or Flames of Freedom to see what other people have been able to do to stretch out the real boundaries of what the narrative core happens here with ZWEIHÄNDER. Now, it can be a little hard to figure out what's changed from a design from reduction standpoint, because it's just easier to notice whenever things get added rather than whenever they get removed, right? So whenever I say that there's been a lot of laser-focused polishing, I truly mean that they're doing a lot of editing to reel back on the overall page count. I mean, this is a notoriously bloated system that I'm extremely happy to see they have been doing these cutbacks. However, for making this video, it can be really hard to point out exactly what has changed and what has been removed. So I spent the last couple of weeks studying. PDFs. I read a lot of PDFs and I didn't have that as a physical device for this gag, so I had to use the phone. In the last 3 weeks, I've been studying ZWEIHÄNDER's revised core rulebooks, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, 2nd and 4th edition, Flames of Freedom, Blackbirds, and the ZWEIHÄNDER starter kit. I was already familiar with ZWEIHÄNDER's revised core rulebook, and I had looked at the starter kit, but I hadn't really done a big deep dive into how this system had evolved over time. I wanted to have that kind of confidence going into looking at the Reforged documents so that I could speak a lot more intelligently on it, I guess, yeah. But this is always having the bad side effect of now I have to cram 3,500 pages worth of research into this 10 to 15 minute video, and I have no idea how we're going to do that, but I'm going to give it a shot. Let's do a real quick, brief overview of ZWEIHÄNDER's resolution mechanics, so those of you that aren't familiar with the system will know sort of what's going on and what unique stuff it's bringing to the table. It's a D100 roll under system, which means that you're going to have a lineup of stats ranging from 0 to 100, and if you roll the D100 and either roll that number or below, you succeed at what your character is trying to do. Those of you that have played Call of Cthulhu or this game's ancestor, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you're going to feel pretty at home here. You're also going to have a lineup of different skills that you can take advances in that feel a bit like training or proficiency, and these are going to give you a 10% bonus increase on that number, so it makes it easier for you to roll at or below that number. These advances range from 10 to 30% at max, and there's also the flip to pass, flip to fail mechanics in here that feel a bit like advantage disadvantage from something like 5e. ZWEIHÄNDER also operates on a much smoother combat engine than its predecessors. What you're getting here is a peril and damage tracker rather than the traditional TTRPG hit points. This might feel a little bit weird, but trust me, I like the cinematics of this a lot more than the idea of tracking the hit points, right? Because whenever you're tracking the hit points, this intrinsically roots it more into a sort of video gamey feel. And this is more of a cinematic tactical idea rather than like number go down, things be bad. I'll get more into that whenever we make a character using the Reforged rule set, probably in a couple weeks, but that should at least give you a brief idea as to what this system is dishing out. In talking about design from reduction, it's easy to say that everything's been streamlined, but it's difficult to explain why it needed streamlining. In Zweihander's case, you only need to hear the sound that a small dog makes whenever you drop the core rulebook on it to understand that this thing needs some cutting down. I used to have a really hard time recommending Zweihander because of this intimidating page count. At 669 pages, it's one of the heftiest tomes in my entire TTRPG collection. Which is why I was really happy whenever Daniel Fox told me that Reforged is cutting out over 200 pages worth of material here. This isn't content that they're cutting, it's a lot of the fluff and sort of overwriting that happened as a result of this thing just being developed before, I think, the rules light movement and a lot of a focus towards practicality in TTRPGs. The revised core rulebook was written at a time where everyone was striving to make these bigger, intricate subsystems to get a cut of the Minecraft, Skyrim, World of Warcraft pie. The dream was to create a TTRPG that did all these hyper-simulative experiences rather than stay in the TTRPG fantasy dungeon crawler lane. This was literally the stated goal of Wizards of the Coast whenever they were working on D&D 4e. The problem here is that all of these games are trying to cover everything that might happen as opposed to focusing on what they know will happen. And what this wound up doing is cutting back on practicality and accessibility along the way. There was also the trend of a lot of games that were packing mechanically meaningless aspects of character creation under the guise of roleplay inspiration. There's just certain tables of your character aspects that don't really need to be eating up your page count and almost overwhelm the player by the amount of variety that's in here and make them feel like they're actually somewhat more restricted. Just as an extreme example here, should a numerical value for your character's anal circumference really have any kind of an impact on your fantasy dungeon game? No, it shouldn't, Fatal, and we're done having that conversation. There's just some things that aren't really necessary to include during character creation to really get the fantasy TTRPG role-playing experience. This is a huge driving force behind the rules light movement that's been really making some of the best-selling games in the TTRPG hobby in the last 5 to 10 years. This is why I'm really happy to say Reforged is following suit here. If you just look at talents, the sprawls of flavor text have been cut back from every talent, with only the mechanic left to tell the story of the feature. There's still the fluff of your character details, but even that fluff is being delivered more concisely. Previously, we had things like age group, distinguishing marks, complexion, build type, ancestral, height and weight, hair and eye color, and all this stuff was spread across 7 different pages in the revised core rulebook. Now in Reforged, what we have are your stature and your build. You do still have the distinguishing marks, but it's not as intricate of a subsystem, but literally all the rest of the fluff is up to you. It's a great change here that not only helps out with their page count, but also cuts back about, I'd say, around 5 to 10 minutes in character creation. That's just one of the areas where we're seeing this kind of polish. Another one that I thought was really clever is whenever you're generating your stats, you're no longer rolling 3d10 plus 25, you're now rolling 2d10 plus 30. So they've literally just taken that die, taken the average roll, put it into the flat modifier, and it removes one calculation from a roll during stat generation. This sounds so minor, it's a quality of life change, but I just thought it was really clever, and it saves about, like, I don't know, maybe a minute or 2 on your character creation. To also add to the product of its time kind of quality to Zweihander, this was also a game that was written over the course of about 5 to 6 years before it was polished in 2017. So, of course, a lot of this was written during the internet Wild West days, and critiques have recently been raised about the way that some of the more Grimdark Edge material was handled. In recent years, some of the ancestral lore has gotten critiqued, and it just hasn't really aged well, to put it very, very mildly, but what we're seeing is a lot of changes that aren't really made for censorship, but more for care. Things like the mutation keywording is being changed over into malignancy now. A lot of the ancestries have gotten reconceptualized from the ground up, and from what I've been told, the intention here wasn't necessarily to gut the idea that this was supposed to be a horror role-playing game that tells these darker stories, but just sort of handle these with a bit more maturity than they had previously. I've also been told that they're reworking the layout entirely, because if I'm being honest here, the Zweihander core rulebook really suffers from a layout perspective. I'll just give some examples here. Headers don't always do a great job of breaking apart and sorting mechanic information. Just like a corruption, arguably the showpiece roleplay subsystem of the game. In the revised core rulebook, it's tucked away under alignment and ranks on page 72 without the section and header it really deserves. It's also not listed in the table of contents, and the index seems to be missing referencing it on page 72, while directing you to the game mastery section that doesn't explain it to the players. All the profession tables are also slightly confusing to parse out. Due to the row colors, I can't help but read these as if you get all the bonuses in a role when you acquire them. These are all actually categorized by the type in all caps in the left row and the specific bonus in the right row, but it feels a bit murky to interpret. They already started improving this in Flames of Freedom, and I've seen an even more improved version in the Reforged documents that I'm stoked to see implemented fully. When I was talking about some of these layout concerns, I was directed to go check out the ZWEIHÄNDER starter kit to see not only some of the mechanical changes that they would be making for the Reforged, but also what the overall layout would sort of feel like here. Unfortunately, Daniel Fox sent me this gorgeous wrap box to dig into, and this is my letter opener. I've mentioned in the past how this is like one of my favorite starter sets. I think maybe only the Dragonbane one is probably a step up above this. It definitely really competes with the Pathfinder one. But basically you're getting this player's guide right here, these dice, right? This is a thing that we super care about because I want to see the layout. But I will just mention all the really nice character sheets you get in here. After those, you get these damage and peril trackers that you're going to use on your character sheets. You get these fortune points. Fortune and misfortune is kind of a fun... Oh, that punched right out. It's kind of a fun idea, like inspiration from D&D in a way. Your moderate and severe grievous injury cards right there. A bunch of the maps right here that are drawn by MapCrow, if I'm remembering that right, here on YouTube. And then the game mastery secrets. And then this has an adventure, like I was mentioning earlier, written by James Introcaso in it. That I really love what all they do with this starter kit. You're getting quite a lot, including, oh yeah, this poster back here that you can see the lower quarter of, I guess. Wow, really great stuff, Taron. So if this is going to be the direction that they're taking the Reforged stuff in, I'm really excited to see it because I've seen some things in here like showing artwork that shows what the dice are actually rolling and what that means whenever they do that roll, how you read them, right? It's not just assuming that players are going to be able to read the dice like you get over in the revised core rulebook. Very minor changes like that. Tables are way more broken up now where we have darker headers for them. They're a lot easier to read because of the color differentiation compared to the page itself. I adore the shakeup in the header hierarchy because they chose to use small caps instead of all caps, number one. Number two, there's actually size differentiation that you can tell. It's just, there was some of the headers over in the revised core rulebook that are center aligned and they're really close to the size of some of the smaller headers, and it was kind of confusing, but they're also using different colors to break up these headers. These are very slight changes, but it's making the rulebook overall way more readable. That's a lot of the mechanical and sort of layout changes I've seen that I can really appreciate, but talking about what's happening here, I guess specifically, how is this Reforged project also enhancing Grimdark, right? Like, this is a genre that's always been a bit difficult for role-playing games, especially if you're trying to fit this into the high fantasy superhero ones like D&D or Pathfinder. The characters over there just tend to really take the piss out of a lot of grimdark tension and turmoil. The overall power scale intrinsically clashes with the kinds of characters that we're going to see in stories like The Witcher or Christopher Bullman's Between Two Fires or anything from Joe Abercrombie, really. A 5th level wizard in any of those worlds would likely be regarded as a god, and just it's weird because, like, we really want to deliver on grimdark narratives and we really want to give people the D&D character optimization or character creation tools rather, but we can't really give them all the punch of a D&D character. There's also been this really weird quirk to a lot of grimdark games where they keep making super peasant characters rather than a character that actually feels like a grimdark hero in a sense, right? This might sound a little bit odd, but it's a real weird quirk to this genre of games where they tell you something like, here, we're going to go hunt a werewolf, and they give you a broom, a bucket, and a pig rather than silver bullets. You go out and hunt, and it's almost like more of a gag. You're making characters that are more, like I said, these super peasant punchlines rather than grimdark protagonists. This is the really difficult thing here, because if you want to make a grimdark protagonist, it can be a bit difficult to find a game that strikes the right balance of grit and glory, but I honestly feel like the Zweihander Reforged is hitting that note better than it ever has. So originally in Zweihander, death was the end for your character, but in the Reforged, they're aiming for more like tropes to explain what may prevent your character from death instead, even going whole hog into just saying like you can do the Soulsborne, like we come back at the last bonfire, right? So these are things like plot armor, last stands, miraculous twists. These are all just moments in the story that prevent your character from dying if your table decides not to go that route. This doesn't mean that your character can't die, but it's more of a conversation as to whether or not them dying is actually moving the story forward rather than being a tactical stick to the adventure carrot. What this means is death can be completely off the table in Reforged. Instead, you're going to accumulate things like afflictions, scars, injuries, and all this, so long as the story can move forward in time for you to join back up later on. If there's a story explanation for why your character would be there after having experienced maybe everyone thinking that you were dead, go with that instead, especially if it's what your table's going to prefer. Think of this like Jon Snow being revived, or a monster knocking out Geralt of Rivia only to drag his body back to a lair where he awakens later on, or, like I was saying earlier, your character in Dark Souls respawning at the last bonfire. It attempts to take a lot of the sting out of death, but it's doing so by pulling inspiration from a lot of the source material that informs this genre. In my review of Candela Obscura, I had knocked it for unintentionally omitting its player character death mechanics, but there was something that I mentioned in there that some people did latch onto. Honestly, I think they might have just missed the opportunity here to not only distinguish Candela Obscura from its predecessors, but explore a unique horror that we don't often see, the horror of immortality. I think that this could have actually been a pretty interesting experience, that they could have said, you know what, we don't really like death in the game, but if you want to make a horror game, they could have made the artistic choice to say you don't die, but actually explore why that is and why that could be an interesting thing. Well, it turns out Zweihander's doing just that. Immortality is a thing that you can explore as a potential existential or philosophical horror mechanically expressed in this game. Your character isn't a hero, you're a survivor. You even have a brush with death as a part of creating your character, similar to Vaesen's trauma giving you the sight. You might be a protagonist, but your character is being subjected to the world rather than you subjecting the world to your character. After all that, I guess my overall thought here is really, I think that this could be a home run. I think that this is a system core that has unfortunately had a couple of attempts that just haven't quite been able to deliver on the full punch. And now from what I'm seeing, this is actually looking to be a really, really appealing one. I like a lot of what they're doing with their different settings. I know Flames of Freedom is one that I'm certainly super stoked to really get into. But anyways, so if any of this sounds interesting to you at all, please check out, using the link below, the Zweihander Reforged Kickstarter run by World of Game Design. And please use that link so that they know I sent you their way, right? And next month, I'm actually going to be making a character using the Reforged rule set. So subscribe if you want to see that, or check out some of my other videos, all that good business. I want to throw out a huge shout out to my Patreon sponsors. Thank you all so much for helping me keep the lights on around here and coffee in my blood. You all are absolute heroes. Thank you so much to World of Game Design for sponsoring this one. Go check out the Zweihander Reforged, and guys, I will see you in the next one.